The Let's Talk podcast was inspired by the MISD's Leadership and Empowerment Team, or LET for short. Our mission is to ensure that all students, regardless of race, culture, or gender, have an equitable learning environment so they can become the leaders they want to be. And now, here are your hosts, Daniel Norwood and Ted Madden.
We've hit double digits. Welcome to episode 10 of the Let's Talk podcast. Our guest today is the principal at AC New Middle School, Regina Jackson. Let's introduce ourselves first. My name is Ted Madden. I'm a video producer for MISD, and I'm a 47-year-old white man.
And I'm Daniel Norwood, social studies coordinator for the district and also leader on the LET team. And I'm a 38-year-old black man.
And I am Regina Jackson, principal of AC New Middle School, and I'm also a member of the LET committee, and I am a 51-year-old black woman.
All right. Before we dive into our conversation, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career and how you got here?
Okay. So as I just said, I'm the principal of AC New Middle School, and we were kind of just talking about that a little bit ahead of time. And before that, I'm going into my third year as the principal there. Prior to that, I was an assistant principal at Mesquite High School, and I think we figured out it was 8 years maybe that I was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then prior to that, 1 year at Kimbrough as an assistant principal. And then prior to that, an assistant principal at North Mesquite, as well as a teacher at North Mesquite. So I started my career in MISD in 2000 and came in as a teacher, science teacher.
Science teacher, okay.
That's right.
So yeah,
That's
just
right.
a wide variety of experiences in MISD. So it's hard to believe I'm going on year 23 in education, but 20.
Wow.
Yeah, 20 in Mesquite,
Yeah.
20 years.
And Mary Randall was at North when you were there, right?
Yeah, so when I came as a teacher, I was a science teacher, and she was actually an assistant principal. Mesquite's one of those places, though, if you've been here long enough, you can find a connection with almost everyone. And so it's one of the kind of the precious moments or things about being here.
I know we've talked to Mary Randall, and I know one of the things that she mentioned when we did our podcast was that it was so important for students to see teachers, administrators who look like them. And I know from working with you at North and then also seeing you, move, like you've worked in, I guess, 3 feeder patterns now. This is, the North feeder pattern, the Mesquite feeder pattern, and Poteet there for a little bit at Kimbrough,
Yeah,
right?
I've been around.
You've been just a little. As you see the number of African-American women on campuses as teachers and leadership roles, can you tell us a little bit about why that's significant for our young men and women on campuses, and a little bit about what that means to you?
Absolutely. When I came to as I said, I came to North Mesquite, came to the district in 2000 and started at North Mesquite. And so I actually went back and kind of looked at some of the demographics, data on that. When I came, I didn't know specifically kind of what those demographic numbers were, but I went back and looked. I knew that there weren't very many. So when I came, let me back up a little bit. When I came to Mesquite, or I applied to be in Mesquite, I was coming from Dallas. And I remember telling a few people that I was coming to Mesquite. And at that time, Mesquite had a kind of a reputation that they didn't hire African Americans. So I was pretty, from when I was talking to some of my friends about it, they was kind of shut down, like, you're never going to get hired there. Mesquite, they don't hire African Americans. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting. I interviewed with Lanny Frazier, and I was hopeful that I felt that I was definitely prepared and had the ability, and I felt like I was a good educator, strong. Yeah. But went into it kind of thinking that, I probably won't, I'll get an interview, but I probably won't get hired. So I was really surprised that when I interviewed with Lanny, he actually hired me kind of on the spot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was really surprising. And so I went over and met with Susie Court, and she basically offered me a position at that time. And so I was really excited about the opportunity to kind of work with Mesquite because they also had a really strong reputation for academics. Mm-hmm. And so I was excited, but I remember the first time that I walked in and I met the staff coming in kind of as a new teacher. I was just very surprised a little bit, even though I knew that Mesquite had their reputation. I didn't see very many people who looked like me. And so, for a lot of times in various spaces, that's probably one of the first things that most African Americans really notice when they walk into a space is, how many people, you look for that connection a lot of times. And so that was one of the first things that I saw, that there was Mary Randall. And I think at that time, I was probably one of maybe 6 on the staff. Yeah. And so even when you look at the number of students at that particular time, and you think about that was 20 years ago, but the student demographics, there was 70% white and probably maybe 11% Hispanic, an equal number.
That sounds about
Yeah.
that sounds about right for 2000.
Yeah, so there were very few Black students, period. And you think about kind of what that looks like today, it's pretty much the opposite. So you look at now, about North Mesquite is about 70% Hispanic. The African American population has pretty much stayed very constant.
About 10, 12%.
Yeah, it hasn't grown very much. It's up and down. But when you look at that, now there's about 11% white students at North Mesquite. But one of the things I noticed again is that there were very few students of color. There were very few staff members of color as well. And so when I think about that, when I think about kind of what that means, it was very significant to me, my role in that. And so when I went back and thought about kind of opportunities that students have, and sometimes there's always a feeling like there's only certain things that can be accomplished. And I took the fact that I was there, that role, very seriously, and I knew that for a lot of the students, that this was going to be the first opportunity they had to have a teacher that was of color. When I became into administration, I also took that very seriously because I recognized the fact that for some students, when you don't see something, it's hard to believe or see that as an opportunity of something that you can be, that you can aspire to be. And so I saw that as my role as an African-American, or one of the very few African-American female administrators in Mesquite at the time. It's different now, but at that time, there just were very few. And I hope that students would have the opportunity to see that as an opportunity that they had for themselves, and maybe that's something that they could aspire to be, that those doors are not closed. And I think that the weight of that, or their responsibility, is felt by many African-American administrators in this district, as they recognize the fact that there are students that are seeing you, and you hope that they see, they look at you and see, the things that you've been able to accomplish, and see that as an opportunity for some things that they can accomplish. And again, as we know that, when you're not able to see something, it's just kind of hard to imagine that that's something that's an opportunity or a door that's open and available to you.
How much has that feeling of responsibility evolved over your 23 years as an educator? Did you come in immediately thinking that way, or has it evolved and become a more important aspect of it?
I would say that I came in with that. I think, and that's not unique to me, is again, I said, I think that responsibility, or it weighs heavily on most African Americans. You recognize the fact that you feel, I don't know if you recognize, you feel that there are eyes on you. You feel that your performance may be being judged a little bit differently, and you recognize the fact that the opportunity for others to come behind you weighs heavily on the job that you do. And so if you do a good job, then you recognize that there may be the opportunity for others to kind of come in. But you also recognize the fact that if you do a poor job, that may also close some doors for, some individuals and students. And so it weighs heavily on you. And you come in with that, knowing that.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, in our book studies, and we've talked about it too, the idea that you become a representative for your race.
Absolutely.
And part of that, I think, is just, the way that we look at behavioral norms for different groups, and sometimes the judgment that comes from, sometimes when we talk about it, I think in our book study of African American behavior being judged by the actions of one individual versus, I think when you look at white communities, that the normal behavior is kind of seen as, hey, this is one standout person if you see a negative action. And that's something that we have talked about.
I finally finished. So you want to talk about race? And she talks
wow.
about that. If you see a bad Asian driver, you chalk it up to it's because they're Asian. If you see whatever the stereotype is,
absolutely,
if that person is that race, you can assign that stereotype. Yeah. And as a white person, we don't get that. If there's a white bad driver, he's just a bad driver, right? Or any number of things,
right?
And so it's I don't know if burden's the right word, but it's something people of different races have to carry that we don't.
And I don't even know if you say burden. I mean, we use kind of a different term, and it's kind of been thrown out there. And I when I talk to some of my friends, Black friends, white friends, and we talk about some of those differences, the benefit of the doubt. And so we use the word privilege, and that's part of privilege is that if you're a bad driver and you're white, you're just a bad driver, as opposed to if you are a bad driver and you're Black, sometimes it'll be, well, Black people are just bad drivers. And I said I think we live with that a lot of times, and so the privilege of being part of privilege is the benefit of the doubt, or being given the benefit of the doubt, or the absence of that.
That's a good way to put it.
That is a good way to put
You get the
it.
benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. Regina, I know, and this is probably consistent with a lot of our guests now. I have history with you. We worked together at North years ago, actually, when I first started. So I was one of those teachers who was looking at you as an administrator as well. We had a lot of lunch duty conversations. We can remember that. But I know that was 15 years ago, and so we've seen some changes in education since then. And then, for you being an AP at a high school, then going to a middle school, I know there's a lot of probably different changes that you've seen in education. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those changes that you've seen over time?
Some of the changes, just happened when you look at kind of those demographics that I just described, is how that shift when we started out, again, in North Mesquite, 70% white, 11% Hispanic, and now it is pretty much flip-flopping, and the difference in that. When I became an administrator, I can remember my internship, we had an assignment where we had to kind of look at just kind of changes that we felt like were going to happen. I can remember one of the things that I did was I looked at that trend data and looked and saw that at that time, and when I became an administrator in that internship, that was 2004. So when you even think about that, I think we were at probably 30% Hispanic at that time. Still not the majority, but had grown just in those 4 years from 11 to 30%. And so one of the questions that I answered as an assignment for that internship was looking kind of at the trends that were happening and what did we think the district would need going forward. And I can remember at that time looking at kind of how fast the population was growing. I felt like we were not going to be prepared. And so I remember that kind of making that in my statement because when I was in Dallas, because that I was accustomed to teaching in an urban district, a large Hispanic population. It was North Dallas High was also considered the International School of Texas because there were 33 languages spoken in that school. Oh, wow. And it was a newcomers, basically school. And so, I was even though I didn't receive training, I was an ESL teacher. A lot of my students did not speak English at the time. And so there were lots of programs and there was lots of support provided. So then I come to Mesquite, and there's very few really, Hispanic students. But then when I became an administrator, I saw kind of how it was growing, and then I'd already been kind of in that environment. And I remember thinking or putting in my statement that at this time that we were not prepared for the growth. And that in the next 5 years, looking at how fast the population was growing in Mesquite, the things that we were going to need. Because at that time, we didn't have any ESL classes. We didn't have any what we call sheltered instruction. And so those are some of the changes. Yeah, we didn't. And so the population was growing really, really fast. And what I saw was that a lot of teachers were struggling because at that time, there wasn't the education, there wasn't the professional learning to be able to kind of really understand the students and their needs, their culture. So some of the shifts that I've seen obviously have been, kind of trying to catch up, but putting those things in place to understand kind of what you need, not necessarily that you have to speak, that you have to speak Spanish or that you have to know everything. But there's some specific things as an educator that if you are passionate about making sure that students achieve, all of your students, that you need to be aware of. And so those are kind of some of the shifts that I've seen is that there's been more put in place over the years to kind of build the capacity of educators to meet the needs of students that may not necessarily be from a culture that you're from. Some of the things that I've also seen over the years, specifically when we talk about kind of the achievement and the needs of our African-American students, for years, typically when we looked at that student achievement, there has been that gap where, and it's just almost kind of like it's been expected that that gap is just going to exist. And so I've seen just over the years, especially now, maybe in the last 3 to 4 years, where there's really been some constructive conversation about the fact that this gap doesn't have to exist. And part of the reason why it exists is because maybe there's just a lack of understanding about what this particular group of students needs. Those are kind of some of the shifts that I've really have kind of seen, just really trying to catch up and build capacity at the same rate that we're understanding that population is continuing to grow. And when you look at, I've talked about kind of that population, really that kind of boom with the Hispanic population, but even when you look at over the years with our African American students, it's really kind of interesting how the gaps in achievement have continued to be there, even though that population has continued to be pretty constant. Right. But it's something that we're still working through. But I'm pleased at kind of the conversations that have happened just really over the last couple of years, with the understanding that as an educator, there's some things that I need to do on my part without understanding that the students are going to change to kind of meet my need.
Right. That's what you bring up is so good because it's responsive. Mm-hmm. And I go back to, and I know we have the book studying on culturally responsive teaching practice. It's everything. It's everything because it really, I think, allows the teacher or the educator to look and reflect on, hey, what are my practices in the classroom that may be preventing this group of students from actually achieving, as opposed to looking at that gap and saying what's wrong with them.
Yeah.
And I think viewing it through that lens, with some of the conversations that are going on now, I think is something that probably hasn't happened enough. Because we've looked at language barriers, we look at SPED, we look at all of those things, but understanding a student may not feel connected to school because their culture is just not brought up.
Well, you think about kind of, that culturally responsive teaching or approach, and it's some of the things that we, continue to kind of talk about. And even, on my campus, there are conversations that we have. And so there's always this need we need to be direct. We need to really kind of, have those conversations, call them courageous conversations. But there's always this kind of a conflict about kind of how you have that. And especially with me being a person of color, me bringing up that subject as opposed to maybe you, Ted, bringing it up is a little bit different. And the approach that would be used and kind of how it would be how teachers would respond to that. There's a study kind of out there, and I think it's even in Zaretta Hammond's book where it talks about kind of they basically looked at the culture for different countries and kind of looked at and ranked the things that are important to them as far as their beliefs and their cultures and their values. And so the higher you are on this, and so they've ranked them, I think you can have a score of like 100, all the way down. And so they looked at the higher that you are on that, it's an indication that you value certain things as like competition over cooperation, individuality, maybe that pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. And so they looked at the fact that the United States is up there like 90, I think maybe 91, 92, as opposed to Mexico, who is like around 30. And so what that means is that you have those countries that are around on that lower end, that those countries are more not about individuality, but more about like cooperation or collaboration as opposed to competition. So you look at like, where does that show up in education? Well, in education, in the space that we're in now, we're very much about individuals and competition, and even how we compare schools to one another.
Yep.
And so, as an educator, when you think about the responsibility to kind of understand that a lot of my students, if I'm aware of that, then what's my approach in my classroom? Do I value cooperation? Maybe my culture does not. But if I understand that the students that I teach, they do, then where am I setting up systems in my class or in my school where that is valued, that's supported, and that's nurtured? So it's even kind of just understanding those kinds of things. And so I think a lot of times educators will kind of go into it like, do I have to understand all the nuances of a person's culture, food and, those things that we think about, dress and those kinds of things.
Culture, yeah,
but even something like that, understanding like the value system of that particular culture, like how does understanding that and supporting that, how does that play out in ensuring that there's a safe space for my students to achieve,
Mm-hmm.
and my responsibility to develop and nurture that.
So how are you doing that? You're the principal over there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, so it's even having, like what I just mentioned, like certain conversations. And so one of the things I talk about, or I feel as far as kind of, and I've talked a little bit about this with my staff as far as my why. I feel like the value, one of the reasons I wanted to go into administration, and I knew when I went into teaching that I wanted to be an administrator for different reasons. I knew that in the classroom, I had an opportunity to create that space, but I also knew that my ability to be able to kind of, marshal those kind of resources and that support was limited, just my classroom. So I've always known that I wanted to have the opportunity to be able to kind of create that space for, campus wide. And so the benefit, obviously, of being a principal is having the autonomy, authority to be able to do that and say certain things like, when I'm talking to certain teachers and I'm looking at kind of things that are taking place in their classroom, being able to kind of broach that and have that expectation that we're going to put some things in place to be able to nurture our students, that we're going to affirm cooperation as opposed to competition. And so just being able to do some things like that. We've on our campus, we really looked at kind of our students' ability to be able to kind of speak and read and write. And it's not just the importance of doing that as far as kind of like the state achievement or student achievement or that state assessment. But for me, and this is the thing that I try to impress upon my staff, is that the difference in my students being able to articulate their ideas is the difference in, again, them being able to take advantage of certain opportunities. So it's not that we want our students to do well on TELPAS because that's the assessment piece, and it's a very small assessment piece. And so I think a lot of times people don't really pay attention to it. But for me, we have 44% of my students are ESL, and so there's that linguistic barrier that exists. And so this is the difference in a student being able to get a job one day where they're able to take care of their families. This is the difference in my students being able to have a job where they have a little bit of autonomy and agency over their own lives. And so I really talked to them about the fact that getting our students to read and being able to comprehend what they're reading, being able to speak, not just so that we want our students to be able to speak English, but it's the ability for them to leave with the skills. What does it mean for future opportunities for that student? And so as a principal, I can impress upon my students that, impress upon my staff that this is not just about getting them to pass TELPAS, that
Right.
this really is the difference in them being able to have the quality of life that they deserve.
You talk about student agency, and that's such a big part, I think, of everything we do as educators. And I know this was also a topic of the LET committee and what we did that day. Can you give a little insight to folks who are listening about, what we did with LET and how you think that might improve some of the experiences of our students across the district?
Right. Okay. So when we came together, and I remember when you broached the conversation with me and kind of talked to me about it, I was really, really excited about that opportunity. Daniel probably hasn't told you, but every time he comes to my campus, he comes and visits my teachers, but we end up talking, sometimes an hour. And so I was really excited about the fact that some of the things that we had talked about, even, a couple of years ago, like it was actually coming to fruition.
That's right.
And so, it was a long time coming.
Right.
And so I was really pleased to be kind of a part of that. We have brought together members of the community. We've brought together just a range of people. But the most important part to me is the conversations that we've been able to have with the students that have been a part of this. And so it has opened up, or I want to say opened up, but it's also uncovered some things as far as like things that we really, really, really need to work on. And so it was really kind of eye-opening to hear from some of the students. And these are typically students that you would have felt that most people probably would have looked at from the outside and felt like, well, they're high achieving, they're confident, they're competent. These students are going places. They don't have a lot of those, I don't want to say issues, but they don't have a lot of the baggage that we sometimes as educators feel that students, from certain groups come with. And so it was interesting, and I felt like for the committee to hear that our students had some real concerns about kind of some of the educational experiences or some of the experiences that they did not have. And I think that's probably been the most eye-opening part for most of the people in that room. The feeling that even the students who may not have said anything out loud, that sat in that class every day, did the work, were good model students, they had challenges that they had to endure. And so hearing that students speak on that has probably been, I guess, maybe the most beneficial part, or the most significant part for a lot of the people in the room, a lot of the educators who made some assumptions about a student's educational experience.
Yeah, I would agree. I've joked on another podcast. Well, I said on another podcast that I think the first topic and the longest topic was my own department, which was history. I don't know if you remember that first day. I felt like we landed on history and we talked about that for about 2 or 3 hours. And I want folks to know also that you've been a big an advocate of expanding what we read and our knowledge of history too. Can you talk a little bit about like some of the resources that you've heard, seen, things that you've kind of submitted to me too? And I've said, wow, that there's a lot that I think in history, if we take the old narratives, there's a lot of things that we miss.
Yeah, and Daniel and I have talked a lot about this. A lot of our conversations have been really about kind of the lack of information, the lack of knowledge about history, about my own history, the gap that exists as far as my students understanding kind of where they come from. We kind of put some books out there. I tend to share books, when I come across them, because for me it has opened up just a lot of information, but a lot of questions that I have. And one of the biggest things I've questioned as I've come to read more books like So You Want to Talk About Race or White Fragility, the How to Be an Anti-Racist is probably next on my list, but I'm reading that.
Kendi.
So the Price for Their Pound of Flesh was a book that I just shared with Daniel not too long ago. Yeah.
That's a tough read.
And so some of those things, when I read those books now as an adult, and I think the biggest question I have, and I know that from the conversations that we had with the students in our lead committee, these are the questions that they dropped on us as well as my question was, why did I know about this? Mm-hmm. And had I known about this, about this, what impact would that have had on me? Where would I be now? Like how my things have changed. And so as I read more, and now I feel like as an adult, as a 51-year-old woman, like I'm soaking this up. Mm-hmm. And as I'm continuing to read and kind of educate myself, and that's the biggest thing I think anybody can do is just educate yourself. But I think about the gap that's missing for my students when they don't have the opportunity to be able to kind of see themselves in history, or the narrative that is taught to them is one from a place of maybe victimhood and what that does to students. I can remember in my own experience, and even with some of the students that I have now, I'm thinking about a specific incident where I had a student that really got upset, and it was in Texas history, and they were talking about, I can't even remember what the specific concept was, but the subject of slaves came up. And I can remember from me in my educational experience, and Daniel can probably attest to the same thing, it was always when we would get to that part in history, it always, felt like the air felt very tight. Yeah. And I thought about that, and I had no words for it at that time, but I can just remember it was always extremely uncomfortable. And so I know that exists for students today, but I'm thinking about 2 years ago, a student that, they really got into it. He was really upset, came to my office and was talking to me about it. And that was what he was upset about. He was upset about kind of maybe the way that it was being taught, and then, how it made him feel. And the other students in the classroom were kind of saying some things, and it just kind of really reflected or brought back kind of like how I felt at that time. And so you're thinking about like year after year after year, years of students experiencing that, like what that does, but not only that, not that doesn't need to be taught, but there's so many other things that have left out. There's so many other things that could be empowering experiences for students of color that we don't talk about. And so we think about like what that does, like why we are where we are, and how has that gap in history, those things not being taught, how has that contributed to kind of where we are right now?
That's so true. So true.
At a district-wide level, are those gaps closing?
I can say that the things that we've talked about as the Texas Council of Social Studies this year, there was a big focus on uncovering new voices, not just at the secondary level, but also at the elementary level. Because one of the things that I think we recognize, and I recognize it from going back to some of those podcasts that Regina suggested, like Teaching Tolerance and Hard History, is that we haven't talked enough about the agency of people of color throughout history. So even during slave times, what you find is that you have in every generation free Black people who were fighting against slavery, who were well educated,
The resistance.
who resisted. And I think students being able to latch onto that story, because those are people they can identify with. They said, well, because the question comes up, well, how does this last 400 years and nobody fights back? That's the question that I think a lot of students would ask. And, if we don't in class say, hey, look, there was, a Frenchman, Marquis de Lafayette, there was Nat Turner, there were all these different rebellions that people, fought against. There was James Fortin and his family in Philadelphia. If we don't talk about agency, then for students, they don't really have anything to latch on to say, hey, there was somebody who looked like me who took their resources and said, hey, we're going to change society. And I think when you hear that as a student early on, it gives you something to really rely on. One of the stories I love to hear is Benjamin Banneker, who really took on Thomas Jefferson directly in that time. Benjamin Banneker, if you know, is a well-educated Black man who actually wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson, and they exchanged correspondence back and forth, where he said, hey, look, this is what you've said about Black people, but I'm well-educated. This is the way I feel, and this is the way I believe. And so I think when students read those stories, I think it gives them a little bit more to come back to class and say, look, I studied this guy, and he's like me. I think those are the things that are being done in social studies now. In Mesquite specifically, we're doing a training on, we're calling it Uncovering New Voices or Hidden Voices in History. And we did one in the fall where we brought up different people in history that our teachers can teach. We're going to continue to do it in the spring and probably for years to come, so that our teachers, when they teach the course, they're not just relying on textbook knowledge, which tends to follow old narratives, but they're increasing their own knowledge into what people they bring into history and talk about.
Yeah. One of the and just kind of brought to mind kind of some of the things you talked about, kind of, what's happened now. Even with English, we look at kind of just in the last couple of years, there's been a really big push. They talk about the windows and mirrors, but a really big push to be able to have students read, texts where they can identify with the character, or they see characters in places where they're affirmed, their culture is affirmed.
Yep.
And so I've really been pleased to kind of see that happen as well. Like some of those, maybe those more traditional texts we've kind of that we've been pushing for a while where,
right.
Not that they don't have value, but I think it's important for kids to be able to see that, me, my culture, everything about it.
It
that,
matters.
it matters, that I'm valued. We have a class on my campus, and we started it a year ago. I don't think we did it my first year, but we took, because you also had to find the right person for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's always this thing that boys don't read. And and that narrative kind of exists. And I think we just kind of, as an educator, like, boys just don't like to read. Well, no, boys do like to read, but boys like to be able to read about characters that they can connect with. And so we started a class. I had some students that were struggling readers. And so we identified those kids early on. And so I went to, at that time, it was Coach Fofang. And I kind of got with him and talked to him about kind of an opportunity. So he wasn't going to teach health. And I'm like, I got a great idea. I'd like for you to teach reading. And so, of course, having the coach teach reading and doesn't have a background. And so I kind of explained to him, look, I don't want you to teach, I'm not asking you to teach grammar and punctuation and things like that. But here's what I really like you to do. Right. I've got a group of boys who, are struggling readers. They've been identified as that. And I don't want to put them in a typical your reading acceleration class. But what I would like for you to do is just read. Like I've got some books, some Jason Reynolds, some Kwame Alexander. All you have to do is just read, have them read silently, read out loud, and just discuss it. it was amazing. And he did some great things with that class.
That's awesome.
And so at the end of that, our boys had read, and these are boys that had not read an entire book. None of the boys had read an entire book. They'd been in their classes. Yeah. That's not very uncommon.
It's not.
Because a lot of times now they will read pieces of a text, but they don't read a whole book. And so, even your kids that are not struggling readers, they don't get the opportunity to do that a lot of times. So for these boys, it was interesting because they read 3 books. Jacqueline Woodson was another. Harbor Me was another great book. The students read all 3 books from cover to cover. They had some great discussions about the books, and they own the books. It was, I'm going to buy these books. These are yours. These boys were carrying these books around, having conversations about how they're going to share them with their younger siblings. And so we know that they will read, but it's where do I get the opportunity to see or read about characters and storylines and themes that I can identify with, that I can connect with. And so they got the opportunity to choose. Unfortunately, COVID happened, and so they didn't get the opportunity, but they had picked 3 more texts that they wanted to read. And so had we finished the year out correctly, these boys would have been able to have said that they read and owned 6 books. So we are continuing that. We're doing it with Coach Coleman this year, and so we're kind of talking about this. So it offers,
Very cool.
It's a mentoring program at the same time, but it's also kind of offering those kids that opportunity to develop those literacy skills, which are extremely important. Not just so that they can pass that state assessment, but again, if you don't read well, you can't articulate, you can't comprehend, you can't think at that level, then there's a definite ceiling. Doors are just closed for you. Mm-hmm. And so impressing upon our staff that the opportunity, that's what we need to be thinking right now, is that you're opening doors. You may not see the student walk through those doors, but that's just how important your job is. Every day you're providing those opportunities to be able to do that. So we got another group of boys, and they're reading, as well. And, awesome. And so just being able to kind of see them work through that process, and have the staff the ability to be able to kind of do that and have them value that process as well.
Well, we went well past the normal amount of time that we do, but it's an arbitrary time that I set every week.
It's a normal
and I
conversation.
think it was well worth it.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. Thanks, Regina.
All right, thank you.
That's Regina Jackson, principal at AC New Middle School. Next week, we'll visit with Emilio Duran, now the district's Director of Personnel Services, who was the first Latino principal in Mesquite ISD. For Daniel Norwood, I'm Ted Madden. Let's talk again next week.